we're real good at losing. But losing isn't the problem. Giving up is the problem.
Welcome to The Craft of Campaigns. I'm your host, Andrew Willis Garces. In this podcast, we go behind the headlines and hashtags, inviting movement storytellers to share lessons from social justice campaigns. Campaigns are a series of collective actions focused on winning a concrete demand beyond one-off mobilizations or election cycles. They have villains and heroes, teams that make plans to win, and activate people on the sidelines. In each episode, we explore one campaign through first-hand interviews for key lessons, principles, and practices for organizers today. Our next two episodes are about campaigns that succeeded against one of the most difficult organizing challenges we can face, winning against a quote-unquote done deal. They're both similar to the fight we explored in episode 3, when immigrant tenant organizers in Queens were being told that Amazon's second headquarters was inevitable. We're going to hear about another development fight today, and again, like in New York, a Democratic governor and the mayor of the sixth largest city in the country had teamed up with billionaire developers to impose predatory new developments on two of the city's working class neighborhoods. A week before this campaign launched, the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper printed an editorial representing the broad political consensus back in the fall of 2006, calling the development a done deal and essentially telling opponents not to waste their time. What was this project? Two new huge casinos. Casinos aren't always on the list of harms billionaires cause that those of us on the left reflexively mobilize against. But the research is pretty clear. They're mostly an attempt to put a band-aid over the hole that decades of state and municipal tax cuts have put on our public finances. And they generally don't even accomplish that goal, and instead bring harms like gambling addiction and property depreciation to the people in closest proximity. But whether or not you agree with that statement, this campaign stands out for how quickly the organizers moved a skeptical public in their direction, with the city's elected officials following along almost as quickly. And they did it in part by imposing rules on themselves as organizers designed to generate more creativity, such as refusing to ever hold a march or a rally. Despite that limitation, within the campaign's first 6 months, tens of thousands of Philadelphians had participated in Casino Free Philadelphia's first 3 mini campaigns, and dozens had joined the group's organizing teams. This campaign also stands out for just how many times Casino Free was defeated in the courts or in the state legislature and managed not to give up, instead, discovering a new way each time to reflect on the latest setback, rest, reset, and pivot in a new direction. Have you ever wanted to throw in the towel after an election or a court decision didn't go our way? Now, imagine that happening about 15 times in 3 years. And still, Casino Free Philadelphia accomplished most of its goals. I rode the Chinatown bus up from DC to Philly in May of 2007 during the culmination of the group's third short campaign on Election Day and helped staff one of the dozens of 4-foot tall red and white cardboard ballot boxes they had placed next to polling places around the city. Their proposed buffer zone on casinos had been scheduled to be on the official ballot, but a month ahead of the election, the elected state Supreme Court threw it out. So, Casino Free decided to make sure Philadelphians could weigh in anyway, and they raced to get these boxes custom printed and train enough volunteers to position them everywhere. I'll never forget watching voters leaving the official polling place where I was stationed, their faces lighting up as they realized they could still vote on whether casinos belonged in neighborhoods. And I remember a sitting city council member walking away after casting his official ballot, and an elderly voter grabbing his arm and saying, "Aren't you going to vote for the 1,500-foot buffer?" It was that kind of pressure that led most of the city's elected leaders to publicly declare they would consider the group's, quote, mock election a binding referendum. I learned so much watching Casino Free, about what was possible if we just refused to lose. Daniel Hunter is the Associate Director for Global Training at 350.org, where he has developed numerous open source training materials available in many languages. He has trained thousands of activists, from ethnic minorities in Burma, pastors in Sierra Leone, to independence activists in Northeast India, and has written multiple books, including The Climate Resistance Handbook and Building a Movement to End the New Jim Crow. And he was an architect of Choose Democracy, a campaign to stop a coup in advance of the 2020 election. Daniel Hunter, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Coming to us live from
just outside of Philly, a little town called Cinnaminson, New Jersey, just across the river.
Okay, great. So we always start with, can you give us the trailer if this was a movie? Like, what's the campaign? Just like briefly, what do you think? Why do you think it has a lot of lessons for us and movement organizers in 2022?
So the Casino Free Philadelphia story would be a story about how 13,000 people decided to do direct action together, where almost none of them had ever done direct action together, and somehow managed to beat back all the money forces in the city, all the politicians, and two massively bankrolled casinos, and to win huge, gigantic concessions.
And what does that have to do with 2022? Are there a lot of casinos that we're fighting?
I think the big thing that this story has really offered and offers people is one, about hope, about what can be done when we do good organizing. But two, it's about the strategic ability, like the strategy of building a campaign that really is rooted in civil disobedience, community organizing, good values, that can speak to a people who have never done it before, have never been involved, who don't have a whole lot of power or political connections. And so it's a story of a bunch of nobodies who are able to make a lot of things happen.
All right. Nobodies who made things happen. And this is a story from way back in 2007 ish. It was a multi year campaign. And just so we know, how do you know about it as a storyteller? What's your connection?
Okay, so my friend Jethro Heiko called me up in 2006, and he calls me up and he says, Daniel, they're trying to put a casino just a couple hundred feet in front of my house. I didn't know anything about casinos. I wasn't at that point particularly anti-casino, but I understood right away it's a bad development for a residential community. Very quickly, I found out, as I learned from Jethro and other people who were having proposed casinos next to them, that the proposals were all in poor neighborhoods. There were neighborhoods that were largely black and brown, though also are white poor communities. There are neighborhoods often that had high addiction. In fact, some of them were one was proposed right across from an addiction treatment center. Another one was right across from a school. And these were cynical places by design, because the casino industry is a cynical industry. So I got into it, and Jethro pulled me in because my background has been doing organizing direct action and as a trainer and educator. And he said, we need to escalate. We've been doing marches in the streets and that's not working. We need to actually put more pressure on more quickly. And so that's how I first got involved in the whole thing.
Okay. So that was the first. There was a phone call and then you jumped in. And can you take us through not just the story or the arc, like if this were a 3-act play or a movie, but like who are the villains? And also there's this idea of, there are people who can give us what we want. We have to move them. We have to move the pillars of power under them in order to stop these casinos. Can you lay that out for us?
Sure. Okay, so Act 1 would be what we call Operation Transparency. So when I started joining with Jethro, we sat around at a kitchen table. Me, Jethro, a guy named Philippe Duhamel, a few other people, Ann Dicker. I don't remember exactly everybody who was there, but we sat down and it was just a handful of us. There wasn't a big movement. It was just a bunch of people who were like, we don't want a casino in our neighborhood. Or we just think this is bad development. So we were talking about how do we begin to mobilize other people. Because at this point, most people just heard about casinos as jobs and revenue. That's what they're told. This will bring us jobs, this will bring us revenue. So 80% of Philadelphians wanted casinos. But what we saw was the fact that this is bad for democracy because we had an industry that had literally bought their way through in a middle of the night deal. They had gotten the whole bill passed at 2 a.m. in the morning. It stunk from the beginning. And so we said, this is one of their weaknesses, this as a democracy issue. So let's find a basic framing that everybody can get behind. And we said, look, everybody thinks that whether you think a casino is good or good idea in your neighborhood or not, you as a neighbor should be able to see what its site plans are, architectural plans, traffic plans, impact studies on the environment, impact studies on the social, on crime, on social impact. All of those documents were made are hidden from all of the residents. They'd filed dozens of right to know requests, been denied at every turn. So this was a bad thing. But bad things, conditions, is not the reason that people become activated. People become activated because they see someone who's able to fight a condition and to challenge it. So we said, we'll create some drama around it. And so we said, look, all these documents should be made public. We're going to ask these documents to be made public by December 1st at high noon. All politics is theater. We're doing theater. So December 1st at high noon, we want all these documents made public. This is about a month and a half from when we're organizing this, beginning it. We said, if they're not made public, we will be forced to take them ourselves. We'll be forced to go into the offices and retrieve them ourselves through a nonviolent search and seizure operation that we called a document search. We launched this whole campaign called Operation Transparency. We had a series of actions every week. And the reason we did something every week was to get into media, also give us a chance to organize rapidly. We did door knocking, and we would knock on people's doors and we would say, next Wednesday, next Monday, next Tuesday, we're doing this action. And we'd invite people to something and they'd say, oh, that's not my kind of action. Maybe the next week, that's not my kind of action. How about this action? So we had a range of different kinds of actions, everything from fun stunts like going and washing the windows on the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board, which was the agency that wasn't giving us the documents. We were washing their windows in order to make them more transparent, to just playing around and having document searches where we'd go outside of their offices and just pretend to search for the documents, do a practice document search. And we did it outside of one of their meetings where big players, Donald Trump's, various other people were coming in, giving their presentations about why they wanted their casino here in Philly. So we were doing each of one of these actions, but behind it was a threat. Behind it was a civil disobedience. And one of the big mistakes that organizers do right now is if we get to a point of civil disobedience, we organize it and announce it in a 1 week, 2 week period. We don't give it the time that the direct action itself becomes part of the story. Not just the action, but in fact the idea that we've threatened it. And so we threatened it a month and a half before we actually carried it out, before we even had the capacity to carry it out. We couldn't have carried it out in the beginning. We didn't have the people for it. But the story became part of it. And so the threat of it, I think Saul Alinsky used to say, the threat of a thing is often worse than the thing itself. And we saw this because the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board began acting even more foolish. Just a few weeks before our civil disobedience action, they threw out a handful of ministers just before Christmas. And the ministers were just asking for a very basic thing, which is they wanted to deliver a letter. They kicked them out, locked them out of their office, and forced an 80-year-old minister to walk down 13 flights of stairs. The reason they did this is because they thought we might be them. And they were scared. And so they began lashing out at all sorts of different people. Well, that action, when they kicked out ministers, and ministers happened to be from Pittsburgh, that gave us more allies, more attention, more press. And so their reactivity became part of our story. And that's the power of civil disobedience. So we did that action. We every week we kept doing some small little action in the streets. But we eventually did have to carry out the civil disobedience action because they didn't release the documents. But when we did the civil disobedience action, we now had a whole set of allies who had never come out before. So we had more people. So instead of it just being a handful of people around a kitchen table, we had grown our numbers. We had, I think, around 80 people who came to the action itself. Good growth for a tiny little group. And we had major coverage in all the newspapers and many of the TV sources. Because we had an interesting story, because we had dynamic, And every single one of them, even the most hostile of them, they all could get behind our base request for access to information. It wasn't an anti-casino. It wasn't this is good development, bad development. It was a simple story of should we have access to information or not in a democracy. And that was the hinge that got our foot in the door. If we hadn't been able to get our foot in the door at that point in time, we would have already lost. The Philadelphia Inquirer, right before we launched the campaign, said this thing is a done deal. But this action was able to kick open the door. So that would be Act One.
So you got the door open a little, and a few more people on your side, maybe a lot more people on your side than before. And what was still left? Or like, what was your theory of how are we actually going to win this? How are we actually going to topple their ability to make casinos?
So at that point, the casinos were just they were steamrolling down the lane. So right after our action, what had happened was is that the casinos got picked. So there had been 5 different casinos possible sites. 2 of them got selected by the Gaming Control Board. Up until that point, the predominant story had always been it's just going to be a done deal. But on that day in which those casinos were going to be selected, the casino licensing process, press asked us, what do you think of it? And we said, it's not a done deal. And the reason it's not a done deal is because the people of Philadelphia have not said that we want these things. We have not agreed. We have not co-signed. And so over the coming months, we will begin organizing. So the first thing we did was we knew the psychology of where people were is the most important thing. It's more pressing than any of your analysis or any of your political analysis. We had to deal with the psychology of where people were, and they were defeated already. So the first thing that we had to do was we had to convince people they had a foot in the door. And so right after the casino licensing processing, in fact, that day, we began describing to people, we're having a strategy retreat on January 6th. Come and join us. We're going to lay out the strategy of how we're going to win. And so that day, which we ended up competing with the Mummers Parade, which those of you who know Philadelphia know, that's a big deal. The Mummers Parade had gotten rained out, and so we ended up competing head to head with it. We had hundreds of people come into a basement on a pretty cold day to come out for a day-long strategy retreat. And in the strategy retreat, we basically laid out 7 different pathways for us to win. A legal strategy, which we knew was going to be a long shot. A direct action strategy, which we knew would be one of the components. A political strategy, which was trying to get political players to bend to our will, which was a tough one, given that casinos had already bought off most of our politicians in the city. And so on. And including, in fact, a negotiation strategy, which was perceived poorly by some people right off the bat. But people began to understand that part of what we would do is we would have a team of people who would sit down at a negotiation table with the casinos and ask for things that the casinos could not reasonably give us, but that we expected as reasonable things. And so part of it was at all of these places, what we're doing is we're setting people up to increase their ability and consciousness and willingness to ask for the thing that they really wanted. And so rather than coming to the negotiation table and saying, what's the thing we think we could really get? We said, you go to the negotiation tables, what do you really want? And we weren't expecting that the casinos would capitulate. What we were expecting, however, is that drama that would unfold about the negotiation, because the negotiations did in fact break down very publicly, very dramatically. We then had politicians in there on our side as it all broke down. All of those things are creating a cocktail in which we're changing the psychology of where people are. Philadelphians, like lots of people in lots of cities, lots of small towns, feel real beat down. And we feel really used to just asking for just the bare minimum. And the bare minimum will never get us what we want, because as long as they know we're asking for the bare minimum, they can negotiate us down even further. So we were going after a different strategy, which was lay out a bunch of different strategies, plug people into the one that they're attracted to. We didn't want to have fights about this theory of change or that theory of change. We wanted to pick a kind of above the board, all of the options. And so the lawyers, they didn't hang out in the direct action group because that never works out particularly well. They hung out in the legal strategy, and they began articulating what a legal strategy would look like. What it would look like to systematically slow down every single inch of the casino implementation process. Every permit, everything would be slowed down to a crawl. All of these things were basically built on economic cost. We weren't going to bankrupt a casino. That wasn't what we thought we would do. What we thought we would do is we would be able to make it so costly that they would have to retreat. That turned out to actually be the winning strategy, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So the primary thing that we did in sort of your, what do you call it, the second phase,
The second act.
the second act here, is we began a campaign called No Way Without Our Say. And the primary structure of No Way Without Our Say was a particular legal situation in Philly. So in Philadelphia, at that point in time, there was no city council member who would support anything. They wouldn't introduce a bill on our behalf, even if they knew it would lose. That's how toxic the casino issue was. What we knew was that there's a particular regulation that if you get, I don't remember the number now, but I think it was if you get 20,000 signatures on a legally binding petition from registered voters in Philly, city council has to vote on the issue. So it's essentially a force on a referendum. City council could still say no, but it's very rarely been executed. So we were moving quickly, swift. That's the way we were working. So between January 12th, when we had finished the strategy retreat and come up with this particular strategy, and February, we pulled together 27,254 signatures signed by Philadelphians across the city in order to force a referendum onto the city ballot. Now, the referendum was very carefully framed. Again, our framing wasn't an anti-casino. Our framing was, should a casino be built within 1,500 feet of a school, church, mosque, other faith tradition? Should it be built within 1,500 feet of a park, a playground, an addiction treatment center, or not? And so it's basically the concept of a buffer, that if we're going to, if we're going to have them in the city of Philadelphia, then they shouldn't be right next to where our kids play. And they shouldn't be right next to where we live. And they shouldn't be right next to where we pray. And that was our basic structure. And so that, again, it was an ask that lots of people could get behind, even if they hadn't thought through the question of casinos or not. People were beginning to sour on casinos. The polling data was shifting. They were down to about 65% support at this point because they were learning about casinos as an anti-democratic force in the city. But we were doing an even more careful framing because we wanted to keep bringing as many people in. We wanted to bring people along. We didn't want to just, this is one of the things we often do as organizers. We ask for the end result. What's the most radical position? And then we fight for the radical position. And I'm all about getting people to the radical position, but I wanted to take people on the journey to get there because I didn't want just the radicals with me. I wanted people who were pro-casino, wanted a casino in the city, just thought it was a really bad idea. We got the head of the Building Industries Association to sign our early petitions because they saw this. So that's what we're talking about. So we're trying to frame it. Right. We're trying to cut the issue in such a way. So there we are. We got 27,000 signature. We were feeling really good because this was going to be a force on city council. So we then begin to meet the force of the casino industry. They sue the pants off this thing. They hire private investigators. They go door to door to people following up who had signed. They trot out their highfalutin, high-powered lawyers to take us on. And they just rip us apart in the courts. And so the petitions were within a day, a traditional petition gathering process and kind of, what do they call it? A petition challenge, traditional petition challenge in the city of Philadelphia. It normally takes like a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks to argue over like a few hundred to a few thousand signatories. Ours didn't even take a whole day. The judge just looked at us and was like, nah, you guys aren't real. Looked at Richard Sprague, who is a casino investor, and said, no, we're siding with them. So we were going to lose in the courts. We got pretty used to losing in courts. We lost, I think, 15 or 16 different court battles. We were really good at losing. But losing isn't the problem. Giving up is the problem. And we told people, these signatures were real and you know it. So we went to city council and we said, you saw us in the streets. You saw us in the subways. You saw us in the coldest of winter gathering signatures. You know they're real Philadelphians. And they vote. We also showed them numbers in their district of who we had gotten as further evidence and further pressure. The city of Philadelphia unanimously agreed. City council said, all right, we're going with you. And so we had applied enough political pressure because we'd become such a grassroots force and looked like such a grassroots force and moved like a grassroots force. We moved quick, we moved big, we got results. That at the end, City Council went with us. So, what are some of the lessons out of this campaign? I mean, this phase that we're in, I think some of the big lessons here are about one, when we organize, we want to create a pathway that people can see themselves doing right away. We want to meet people where they are. We didn't meet people in like, here's how we're going to take out casinos, da 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 da. And we also didn't do it continuing on a direct action strategy. We actually moved into a political system. Why? Because the direct action was going to be good early for the media, but for a bigger movement, we still needed to get more people on our side before they'd be willing to do direct action. We couldn't just move them right into civil disobedience right away. We needed to get to pull people in. And so we used a process that was legally available to them, but we did get them doing something they don't usually do. I think a lot of organizers spend a lot of our time asking people to do things they're used to doing. Sign a petition because that's what you know how to do. We ask people to get people into the streets in the cold of winter, showing up on trolley tracks, asking people for their signatures. That was new behavior for our people, the base that we were working with. And so we're always trying to expand the base, the skills that they've got. I think those are some of the other pieces that I would say about this particular phase.
And I know so spoiler alert, you wrote a whole book about this campaign that we'll acknowledge at the end.
I'll say it now. It's called Strategy and Soul. It's great. Pick it up. Fun story.
It's a wonderful
it's a real
book.
Thriller.
Put it in the show notes. And so you were saying this is some of the things that the reasons that it feels especially relevant right now, but those specific things that you just named about building a base, about earlier when you were talking about the threat being part of the action, or like, don't just rush to flex whatever muscle we've already got, but like set the stage for it, foreshadow it, have a build up. How are those kind of antidotes to what you're seeing right now? If there's like movement plagues and movement antidotes, what are you seeing us do right now that are not those things?
Well, I think one of the big things is that we're relying on a single kind of tactic. So a lot of movements have spent an inordinate amount of time either on just basic digital organizing, let's just get a lot of signatures, or let's go to DC or let's go to some big march on a federal target. And what we saw was one, honestly, like a march is a flex of power, but it rarely builds it. A march is once you have a big group of people, an impressive number of people, and relationships and allies and all these things built, yeah, flex. But it's not a build of power. And it can really backfire if you don't have a big build of power. When you say we're doing a march, you pull a lot of people, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, but doesn't necessarily result in something. And so part of what we were doing is we wanted to get people into actions that they themselves would experience as powerful. So that's really critical here. The psychology of it. When I go to a march, I show up, I look around the march, I say, oh, who are some of the people I know? And do I know anybody here? And try to socialize with a few of them. And then I join some chants, we will not, we did, yay, what now? Justice, got it. And then I go home. And I might feel good. A lot of people who are experts and other folks feel great at the end of it, but they don't necessarily feel powerful because they didn't break a norm of themselves. They didn't create a new story about who I am. That's not to say they never do. It's not to say they never can. But that most of the time it's not new. It's within people's wheelhouse already. But when we had people risking arrest to try to do a search and seizure operation, they felt very powerful. And they said, this is a very interesting way of challenging power. I feel like I'm challenging power. And in fact, they were acting outside of the norms. When we had people in the streets gathering petitions in order to put a referendum on the ballot, they put the referendum on the ballot. If we had the chance to have had a city council member introduce the referendum, we would not have taken it. We wanted people in the streets doing that. We wanted people to do that. So we're not looking for the quickest way. We're looking for the way that builds people's power and their psychology. And that doesn't happen when we just go into the streets. It doesn't happen when we create abstract targets, like always going after the federal government or beating up on Manchin, who most of us don't have any relationship with anyways. We didn't know about them 2 years ago. We weren't paying attention to them. So when we create abstract targets that they don't have any relationship to, they don't get to feel the sense of agency that I did this. It's not
Well,
their victory.
and you didn't go out and do 10 more search and seizure actions. You didn't do
That too.
10 more ballot referendums, because what you could have said is, this made people feel powerful. Let's do this
Do it
again.
again.
Let's do the ballot again. Let's do
A rule to her. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We made a rule for ourselves. We'll never do an action that we've already seen someone else do. It was a loose rule. But what we meant by it was we're always going to stay on our toes. And what that does for us is it does a couple things. One, it keeps us out of ruts, structural, tactical ruts. We make the same list and then we do one of them that we've already known. Two, it also became very interesting for media. We are extremely media savvy. And one of the reasons we were able to stay in the media's attention so often was because the media knew every time we do something, it's going to be interesting. It'll never be the same thing over and over again. It'll be something they haven't seen before, a new twist, a new way in. And the third thing that it does is it also like supports us as organizers to continually have conversations about power in different ways. If it's the same action, it's a similar conversation about power. We're doing civil disobedience because direct action gets the goods. And then we just use that phrase over and over and over again. And then people stop interrogating it because they just get used to that's what we do, the ritual of it. And I'm not challenging anybody who ever does any of those things, but there's a limitation there. And so we made the choice. We made the choice to really push that limitation so that we would always have a conversation with our base. Why are we doing this? And that meant, one, we did become very trusted. So our base began to expect that we had a sense of what was happening. And the second thing that developed out of it was our base began their own political analysis. And so many of our people who have been involved in this campaign are now active players in other movements and savvy, because we got to have a conversation about why do we do direct action? Okay, but why are we doing electoral this time? Why are we doing? And so each of the different things, they got to see the different avenues of change.
And as we start to wrap up, I'm curious too, so you were starting to say, okay, so we had these different phases and they were responding to the conditions that we created, the ripples we created from this last one. Now
Yeah.
it might be an electoral campaign. And there were actually a bunch more campaigns that you document in the book you wrote, Strategy and Soul. Can you give us a sense of, if there were pillars of power, is one metaphor to use, holding up the status quo of casinos are coming to any neighborhood, especially Black and brown neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. There's nothing you can do. And that was the reality. And eventually you got some of them canceled, some of them shrunk. What were the pillars that you had to, like, over time chip away at in order to get to that new reality that you created through these campaigns that were one into the next?
Yeah. The first one is the media. The media had created a storyline that it was a done deal. Operation Transparency really helped disabuse them of that. The second storyline, the second big pillar that we had to remove, was our political allies, so-called allies, frenemies. Frenemies is the word I'm looking for. Our political frenemies.
These were Democratic elected officials?
Democratic elected officials, some Republican, but primarily Democratic elected officials who mostly went along with it because it was an easy way to not raise taxes and a way to get some money into the city. That was the argument. And they had never been disabused about that. Turns out it's not true. But anyway, so the No Way Without Our Say got some of the local city ones. So some of the city council folks came on board. Another major pillar was the people, our base itself, and the amount of despair that really had just seeped heavily into the city. And we've all met it, I think, as organizers. And so we constantly had to have this sense of giving people a sense of agency. There were a couple others. I'll describe, since we promised people 3 acts, I'll get into the third act here. And the third act, it really was after we got city council to go for this completely. So city council said, great, we'll pass the buffer. So what we'll do is we'll put it on a referendum. So again, we didn't ask them to give us the buffer. We said, just put it on a referendum. The people can vote on it. Shortly thereafter, the casino sued. And in a one-line description, the judges in Pennsylvania, who many of them had just received money that seemed to be as part of this casino project, they announced, we're stripping it off the ballot. No explanation, no rationale, no reasoning. But the people of Philadelphia have no right to decide where casinos happen in the city. This is the most blatant anti-democratic thing that happened during the entire time, and there were many of them. But everybody got how anti-democratic this was. Again, being a good loser as an organizer means losing isn't the problem, giving up is. So we decided right away, after some very hectic organizing days, that our response would be we would give people a chance to vote anyways. And our message that we kept echoing was, if the government won't do it, we will. So we gave people a chance to vote anyways on the referendum. We set up hundreds of ballot boxes across the city. We called them our 5-foot shining receptacles of liberty. And this we called Philly's ballot box. And this was giving people a genuine opportunity on the election day to vote. We set up, I want people to understand, we set up a real election. We had an election commissioner who was non-biased. We had election monitors come in. We set up a ballot system that was unhackable, that had double validation, double blind, everything. It was a very fair, and we even invited the casinos to come and participate in running the operation itself so that they could see every step. We recorded everything live. So at the end, we explained to everybody, this is legal. The only thing that makes an election something that people believe in is that they believe in it and they believe in the results. And so we announced to everybody, you're going to believe these results, and we're going to ask City Council to act on them. So at the end of Philly's ballot box, we had 14,000 people who had participated in this act of civil disobedience and acted in this direct action way, which was outside of the official institutions. We call ourselves the other election happening that day. And we had data now in every councilmanic district, every senatorial district, how many people had gone and voted for the other election happening that day and our election. And we had specific results that were hard science that we could then show to people, all of the senators, council members, etc. Here's how your people vote. And that was the moment which we finally broke down full political support. And so Senator Fumo, who is one of the people who helped write the original casino bill, he cracks and he suddenly says, yeah, these casinos shouldn't belong here. And that becomes a breaking moment in which suddenly a bunch of things that were not possible before suddenly become possible. The guy who writes the casino bill sends his political hatchet job people to take out the bill itself. And we begin a very ferocious fight. And it continues, of course, but that really becomes the moment which our organizing shifts the balance of power. And all of a sudden, all these different players are moving.
And we could do another several episodes just on the next couple of campaigns, I think. I'm glad we'll get to link people to Strategy and Soul where they can get that. And I'm curious, just coming back to the present day one more time, you do a lot of work with climate groups and have for a long time. And so I'm just curious, is there a thing you haven't mentioned yet that you feel like is particularly for 2022 climate organizers, even a principle of designing, crafting campaigns that would be especially useful for them right now?
I think one of the biggest things that what you heard in the story was we lost a lot. Mm-hmm. We embraced the loss. Rather than taking an attitude of, which I think a lot of traditional comms now has a kind of attitude of, when a bad thing happens, you say, no, we're still winning. Things are going well. We know that was rough, but we're going to come back. And the tone doesn't match where people are psychologically. On climate change, I'm talking with therapists regularly now about climate change. We're talking about we are entering into a phase of deep mental health struggles as people are really struggling with the impact of the anxiety that people have on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis related to climate and the changes that are afoot and the changes that are going to be afoot. We need to speak to that level, the soul level. And the reason I call the book Strategy and Soul, we need to marry strategy and soul. So that speaking to the psychological means speaking regularly in the language of loss, speaking in the language of we're with you about what you're losing, about what you're missing, about what you're not getting. And rather than embracing a storyline that says we're winners, we're making it forward, we're constantly making progress, telling a story that says we've lost huge amounts. This is the reality of where we are. And joining with people, not leaving them in despair, but acknowledging the reason why the despair is so high, the reason why the skepticism of government is so high among people is because the government is saying that we care about climate change and they're not doing anything. Well, that's hypocritical. That's not just hypocritical, that's suicidal. And so we have to meet that energetically, emotionally. And part of what we constantly did when we did like each one of these actions is we designed them in order to be matching up with where people are and then taking them somewhere. And so we're meeting people on a spot in which they feel like they can't do much. So we're just offering them a little thing and then we extend it to a bigger thing and so forth. But our strategy really wasn't trying to tell people like, oh, we can totally win this, we got this. It wasn't a story of optimism. It was a story of grit, perseverance. But that's in the face of the thing that is negative, the thing that is downing, the deep anxiety that lives around us. And so I think an honest campaign around climate needs to speak genuinely to where people are emotionally. We're not feeling great. We're feeling very scared.
Yeah.
And then we move. Acknowledge that and then move. You feel scared. That's why we join together and do action together. That's why we organize. That's why we build power. That's why we do direct action together.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And as we always end this podcast, is there a wish that you have for movement organizers right now? And you just had one, you just gave one, obviously, around climate specifically, embracing the feeling. But if there were a meditation, if there were a book, a podcast, a poem that you think more of us should be reflecting on right now, what would that be?
It would be the spirit knows before the body. The body knows before the mind. I think we have to return to a style of organizing that honors not just our cognitive, but our emotional and our spirit.
Thank you for offering that, Daniel. Thanks for your time with us today, your stories, your insights. We'll put in the show notes where people can check out the book Strategy and Soul and read more about Casino Free Philadelphia and the campaigns that made up this larger campaign in this fight that we can still get a lot of insight from. Thanks for being with us, Daniel.
Thanks so much for having me on.
The Craft of Campaigns podcast is a project of the Organizing Skills Institute at Training for Change and made possible by grassroots donors. Visit Training for Change for workshops, training tools, and other resources. We welcome your feedback and nominations for other campaigns that should be featured on this podcast. If you like these episodes, please consider donating to keep the show running. This podcast is produced by Ali Roseberry Polier. I'm Andrew Willis Garces. See you next time.